big deal. Banks finally getting named. Who are the big winners here?
So the three big names we've got here are Goldman, Nomura and Deutsche Bank. So if you think about it, that's one from each of the sort of big jurisdictions that we're thinking about. You've got the local bank there, Nomura, going to appeal to Japanese investors, which what we're hearing is they're likely to be the biggest chunk of people. You've got Goldman covering, the US, but also internationally. Then you've got Deutsche there appealing to European investors.
Interesting that they're going so wholeheartedly global. Do they just have to by the sheer size and scale of it? I mean, you usually hear of companies being worth $23, $27 billion, not actually listing that many shares all in one go.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a third of the company here, so we could be looking at a valuation somewhere towards 90 billion. So by its definition, it's global. I mean, if you think back to Alibaba in 2014, that was the last big share sale of this size we saw, and that was 25. So we're going even further than that.
Bob, what do you make of the fact that today of all days is when we hear the banks are being named after what has been one turbulent week?
Well, it is very interesting, Caroline. I mean, I'm sure that this was probably in the works for some time, and it may just be coincidental in terms of the timing. But when we think about why this one is so important, this is all really going to be about 5G and Japan and the 2020 Olympics. You don't tend to think of those things, but Japan is very eager to reestablish themselves globally as a major player. Of course, Masayoshi Son is a favored son there in Japan. A lot of interest in seeing what he can do. And this telecom development in 2019 in particular is going to be the launch of 5G. And there's a lot of focus on making that not just, faster smartphones and things like that, but enabling completely new type of capabilities, things like broadcasting over 5G. And again, that ties into the whole 2020 Olympics story. So I think all of those, the announcement happened to be a weird week because of all the other issues. And I think SoftBank does have some concerns we have to think about from the investments they've received from the Saudis into the Vision Fund. But fundamentally, I think it's going to be very interesting to watch. I think it's going to be a big one. And in some ways, it's sort of a statement or a referendum on 5G and how the world sees 5G.
Bob, remind us of also the Vision Fund and its link here, because it's a $100 billion fund, biggest private equity fund really out there, or venture capital fund out there. They're raising money, they're spinning off their telecom arm to be able to raise more cash for further investment on top of that.
Well, I mean, if you look at what Masayoshi Son has been doing, I mean, he's compiling a huge group of investments between the things he's done with Uber and other companies around the world. WeWork, they're talking about making an additional major investment in. So, I mean, this is a gentleman with a real vision. He always talks about the 100 and 300-year plans. I mean, he's thinking way ahead in terms of what he wants to be able to do. He's bought chip companies or IP companies like ARM. They have a big event next week in San Jose where they're going to be unveiling a bunch of new things. So, I mean, it's very interesting to think about what he's trying to do is compile a huge set of complementary companies and technologies together.
Elizabeth, I want to go back to the overall health of the IPO scene at the moment, though, as well, because yes, we've got one show of strength coming from Japan, but when we looked at China, Tencent, of course, have been in the eye of the storm, and they've backed away from a certain IPO, or at least put it on pause. That's right.
It's been a very sort of turbulent 24 hours for IPOs. When you think about the first sort of places that you see the effect of a market rout, it's often in the IPO market. There were a couple that were pulled in Europe yesterday. Soné and LeasePlan both said that they were putting aside their listings. And then what we're hearing with the Tencent Music is that it's just being delayed a little bit. They've not sort of put everything off, but they've been sort of pushed back until things look a little bit more stable.
It was interesting that we got a rather successful one coming out of San Francisco today, though. They managed to stick to their guns, and Anaplan actually manages to have a successful debut. Yeah,
it was a huge debut. I think the shares are still up 30-something%, and it follows on the heels of Elastic last week, which had a killer first day. So it shows that there are still a few exceptions that can kind of get out there despite the markets.
Yeah, Bob, interesting that software company did so well. What does it feel like on the ground in San Francisco when you're looking at the market turbulence? How have companies, investors, and analysts and voyeurs such as yourself really assessed this particular route?
Well, look, as Shira mentioned in her opening comments, it's all about sort of the feel of the market right now, and how people are feeling is a little nervous when we think about not only the tariffs, but the regulatory environment for tech. Those are big concerns. They seem to be much bigger concerns for larger tech companies and sort of more consumer friendly and aware. You're seeing these smaller, more enterprise focused companies being able to pull off IPOs, and I think we'll see that continue because they're smaller names, not as many people are watching them, tends to be a lot less controversial in terms of what they're doing. And so I think you're going to continue to see that. It's the bigger ones that are at issue. And the Tencent one, obviously I think it's going to be fine, but there is that underlying question of, is there a challenge going on in China? And is this the beginning of a potential challenge in China for tech IPOs because of the fact that a lot of these companies are highly leveraged? There's been some crackdowns there in terms of China as well. And of course, what is the influence of the trade war in the Chinese domestic market? And how does that influence Chinese companies? So I think there is perhaps a lingering question about that. But fundamentally, obviously, it's a huge business. And I think they'll do probably pretty well when it does go IPO.